Pat, do we have any other requests to talk on this? Anybody want to talk on Bethel Island? No. Okay. All right. I think you ought to proceed in accord with your suggestions. Now we're on to the, let's see, in no particular order I could figure out. The appendix showed up, but I think it's probably fair to say that most of the new appendix between this one and the fifth draft Delta plan haven't been finished yet. Nobody's reviewed them or read them, or at least I haven't, and so we're not going to talk about them. This is attachment 1 to 8D. Right? I mean, I look at this and on the left side it says fifth staff draft A through J, and then I believe everything on the final staff draft, which is kind of your shorthand description of what you think you're going to do, is pretty much the same. And these new 5 appendices, lettered in odd ways for designation, aren't yet available. Or at least I don't think they're available. I haven't seen them yet, and I don't think they were in the packet.
I think the Delta Legacy Community Boundaries is one, and those were generally...
Oh, so the maps would be related to that?
The maps would be related to that.
Right, for the legacy communities.
With the state flood control system that's included in the packet.
And we had previously seen legal memos on covered actions and Delta Plan consistency, a user's guide. Anyway, since I don't have anything, and I don't think any council member has anything in front of them specifically, let's just flag the block of appendices that appear to be new that will be coming out for the 6th draft.
I just wanted to say I like this.
Oh, yeah, the last summary thing? Yeah, I did too.
Yeah.
I did too. That's the last item on our agenda. Okay, so we're going to pass over attachment 1 for the time being.
Okay.
All right, let's then go to attachment 2, which is the start of the maps of legacy towns. And the first one is Knightson in Contra Costa County. Dan?
Yeah, and we just wanted you to be apprised that these would be part of the plan and give you a heads up. Again, the question was, we have got now 3 policies that refer to legacy communities, and what does that mean? And so we've worked to try to identify those areas that are planned for development, not for rural agricultural development, but for some other more village style, more urban level of development, you might think, in local government general plans. And so we've pulled those together, and we've identified the boundaries that we would suggest
well, let me
for
just,
those areas.
You've essentially on these maps, if available, have taken a designation by a county of a planning area or whatever, a community boundary or whatever they call it in the various county plans. Contra Costa's done it. Sacramento obviously has done it. Has Yolo done it? Yes, Yolo has done it. Solano?
There are no Rio Vista would be the city.
Rio Vista, okay. And San Joaquin, I guess.
There are none.
There are none. Okay. All right. So the next, then I'm familiar with Knightson in Contra Costa County. It's, mile and a half away from the water now, maybe a little bit more than that. And I don't know when, is this a current picture, by the way?
Yeah, these were prepared for us by CH, so I would imagine if they're like most GIS maps, they're using Google aerial photographs and they're overlaying other layers on them to develop the maps for us.
Yeah. This all used to be former farmland and is pretty rapidly in this area transitioning over. All secondary zone, right?
That would be correct, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Chair, just a quick question. The treatment of the rural residential, like if I look at maybe you're using the designation that the county has used here, but the area that looks somewhat similar on the south side of the road there, the main arterial, whatever road that is, you got some similar development to the north of there. And again, as you'll see some of the maps, some of those from Sacramento County, you've got pockets. We have a similar pocket north of the city of Alton along Tyler Ireland Bridge Road. how do you treat that? Because in one case you show this as, I guess, single-family residential slash or dash high density, but I don't see a lot of differences there unless it's just the reproduction size here of stuff that's north of there as well. So how is it that?
Well, I think in this case there's an urban limit line that's designated in Contra Costa's
Oh, there
general
is,
plan.
okay.
So I think that's what I understand the
Okay.
situation. Again,
Okay.
we were working with maps that were prepared by our consultants in this case, so
Okay.
it's not a community I know in that level of detail.
So,
But we will certainly be checking these with local governments. Yeah.
I know you will. Well, but let me just ask you about the point about rural residential, because you talk about that in some of the policy elements that we went over earlier. We didn't really touch on that about the 5 parcels and anything more than that outside the legacy towns requires a 200-year protection. If you're in a FEMA area, you're going to require at least 100-year protection, which is elevating the structure or doing other things that flood-proof it. So what is the assumption around, if I could just ask real quickly here, around the rural residential, where it's ag residential in Sacramento County, maybe rural residential in another county, or I don't know what terminology they use.
A good place to look would be the next map, attachment 3, which is the map of Freeport.
Mm-hmm.
And in that case, you'll see that the area that's we've included within the legacy community would include a little area of ag residential that's north of town. That even though it's one unit per 1 to 10.
Right.
I think we felt this was the map we got from the county.
Right.
They said, hey, this is what we think Freeport is. We weren't, didn't have a reason really to dispute it with them. I thought, well, maybe should those ag residential areas be out or in? And I just decided, well, I'm going to rely on the judgment of the local government to define what the community is in this situation. It's always a difficult call. Another very good example to look at in this regard, and you'll know more about it than I do, is Hood, which
Right.
is
The
back in
mobile park,
attachment 5, and there the map that we were provided excludes from the community the mobile home park that's there on the upriver side, the north side of the community, and I guess that's how the county has prepared the community plan for that area, and so we just accepted it rather than saying, we're going to tinker with the boundary.
And I appreciate that. And you and I chatted about it in the briefing, and I think there, because they're not tied into the community water system, which is a public water system, they're still served by private well that serves the units there. They weren't in that kind of that area where it had actually allows for a higher density. It says RD5, but they're not those small lots because they're on septic systems. They can't get the separation under other ordinances that don't allow for that kind of density. So I just was curious because, again, I know in Freeport, again, it's because they're not on a sewer system, they couldn't do anything smaller than probably not anything smaller than a 2-acre lot now, and they're up against the levee with those lots. So there's some uniqueness. Again, I wouldn't expect that you pay all the detail, but when you use that overlay and take the map, there may be some circumstances that put them in certain categories that might be real comfortable fits. It may not be universal in the way they're applied county to county, and I think you acknowledged that just a moment ago in your comments. And again, we don't need to spend a lot of time on that, but there's, because the orange that shows on the Freeport map, rural residential, you could do that similarly along areas north of Ileton. And there's a few other little places along the Delta highways and byways where you could find those pockets.
We were trying to define discrete communities that seem to have a compact village form rather than have, there are residences strung along levees all through the Delta, and we certainly don't want to be thinking of all the homes that are along the levee, clear down to Sherman Island. You think about that as being part of some community. We want to say, hey, you're out there, you're a rural residential use, but here's like a compact village that makes some kind of sense to plan for and to think about as a locus for development in the future.
Oh, can I anticipate your question, or do you want to ask your question?
Go ahead.
Okay. The chair asked me a question on the side, and I think it's an important one because we had kind of discussed what the legal import is or will be of using these legacy community maps in the Delta plan. Are we somehow giving them a legal force and effect that extends beyond the discussion that we're having here and for purposes of the Delta plan? And the answer really is no. We're using these maps for purposes that we want to use these Delta maps for in the Delta plan.
Yep.
Just like we're incorporating maps that we've borrowed from the Department of Fish and Game conservation strategy and incorporated them into our plan for purposes of ecosystem policies. So we're not necessarily giving them legal import beyond the jurisdiction of what we're talking about here. And I think that's important. We're not trying to define what a legacy town is necessarily for other people. We're not trying to usurp the authority of local jurisdictions with regard to defining their limit lines or their spheres of influence or legacy communities. But what we are trying to do, I think, Dan, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is work with the local agencies to get a picture of what's out there and then to use those for our purposes.
Yeah,
but to be clear that these are for the purposes of the Delta Plan.
Absolutely. When we have 3 policies that refer to legacy communities, and the question is, well, where does that apply? And that's what we're trying to say. And beyond that, we're not trying to say anything.
Yeah, this is similar to what I discussed with you, I guess, yesterday, Mr. Ray. With the exception of Isleton, Rio Vista, and in an odd way, the Bethel Island stuff, there are no legally established boundaries for these communities. They're county designations, or whatever they call them. But there will be fundamental policy consequences from a formal designation, from the nature of what is included in a Delta Plan policy and coverage and what is not included. So in some of these areas, you look to say, well, wait a minute, like the old mill fight. Well, we adopt a map. The territory of the old mill is there. It's designated as, I think, industrial on the Yolo County map. Don't hold me to that. It's under appeal from a Delta Protection Commission decision the second time. 2 times, Don? I think it's 2 times. Twice. And I don't want to find myself in a position that we have inadvertently concluded that is a proper designation before we know what's in. I mean, and there are endless questions. Don's question, this question. It seems to me that one of the most important things to do is to figure out what the conditional statement is, the purpose for which the maps are being included. For example, I'm particularly concerned, I want to know what the implications are for flood management issues, and particularly since we're going to spend all of 2013 trying to develop levy standards and a financing policy to recommend for state investments. And I am 100% positive that a legacy community designation will have significant financial implications, as it should. But I'll be darn. But I want to. I don't want to wind up making somebody saying, well, you've agreed to spend $726 million by drawing these lines on a map for the legacy towns. Now, that's probably handled easily by having some kind of a combination legal and planning explanation of the maps, and I defer to your judgment. But that would make me feel a whole lot better as we go through it.
Mr. Chair, if I could just to shed just one more small ray of light, but as relates to at least to Sacramento County's general plan, I did go back and we actually have a provision within the general plan, and I think this may apply to some of the discussion, certainly legacy towns in Sacramento County, that our general plan recognizes in the specific languages, and I'll just read a portion of it, says, from time to time, the designation shown on the general plan land use diagram, not just in the Delta, but elsewhere, may not precisely match either zoning or the built environment. And where the uncertainty exists with respect to those boundaries of various land use designations, as shown in the land use diagram, the planning director shall determine location of boundary line. There's a process, if that doesn't work, to go look at historical data and certainly go back to the Board of Supervisors ultimately to make a determination. We actually did that in Cortland a few years ago, where the line wasn't real clear. They kind of just used big swaths with a yellow pen, right. And we had to make a determination. And we went back and forth and ultimately made one, and it wasn't as liberal as some wanted. It was too conservative for others as relative to what they thought should happen. But we do have that latitude, and again, certainly it's guided by other policies in the general plan. I assume other counties and jurisdictions may have similar language, and that's important because that does give some local land. It kind of goes back to that respect local land use, in that it doesn't rise. I wouldn't interpret as a level of significant of having impact on the co-equal goals, but whether it would rise all the way to the Delta Council to have to make that to confirm or affirm that determination might be an important piece, and it might provide some settlement for local entities that you're going to respect, within, looking at that text in their general plans, assuming they have that gives them some ability to interpret, but not to go, beyond that, because it also concludes here, it says these provisions should not be used to avoid appropriate required amendments to that land use diagram, which are general plan amendments or other zoning requirements. So there's a caveat, but it's kind of those bookends that give you some ability at the local level to interpret if, in fact, there's some question. Well, did it really fall in that line, or was that overlay in the town of Hood? Should it have included this or that? Not to extend it out to islands, to the middle of the island, or to, an area that would take in acres and acres. So I only mentioned that because that may, if there's some acknowledgement of that, then that might provide, I think, a level of comfort in whether it's, working with Contra Costa on Bethel Island or anywhere else, that, there's a tweak that needs to be made that doesn't rise to the level of, and I think they go to what you said earlier, Joe, that there's some consultation, and if there's some reasonable application, I think that it would be workable in those situations. So
Let me look at that, and certainly sounds like something we ought to consider.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I think you and Chris have got an assignment on this, and hopefully what you jointly come up with will be reflected in the Delta plan, and it'll answer a lot of the questions. Okay, Pat, nobody mentioned any. Okay. All right. Members, do you want to go through the maps one at a time? We've had a chance to look at them, but Don, I guess your view is Bethel Island has its own unique determination, which we've already given an opinion on, but as for the other maps, you also want to see the kind of explanation, conditions, discussion before there's a formal incorporation.
Yeah, I think there may be some contextual. We didn't have to go for page after page. I think it would be helpful in all three of the counties, though, where you have those. Well, actually four, with Rio Vista being a Solano County, being a city. I think to just have some background. Maybe that's all in the text. I haven't seen all the text behind that, but I think maps are good visuals. People can, as we all know, they're subject to interpretation at times, but I think that you collected it from the sources, and as long as it's properly applied and correctly interpreted, as best we can do that, I think it's going to be about as close as you're going to get as far as any definition. Because as you said, Mr. Chair, there's not, there's it's kind of the zoning and what people know to be the town, and that's kind of the historical aspect. But beyond that, there's not these urban limit lines or urban boundaries in those cases. So.
And I was pleased to see that what we received from the consultants to identify what the proposed land uses were seemed to align so well with what we could see from aerial photos. I was expecting that there would be orchards that would extend into town that would be planned for development and stuff like that, but really be agricultural operations. I didn't see very much of that in here, and so I think what the counties have done in general makes a lot of sense to me. And we'll probably hear from one or two as we, bring the plan forward, and that wouldn't surprise me, but I think those are all things we can work out. We're not trying to jam anybody here. We're trying to just make sure we're clear about what is allowed. Okay, good. Keep walking us through now is the state flood control boundary map. Yes, we refer in the Delta plan to bypasses, which our policy says should not be encroached upon, and so we try to make sure we had a map of where those designated floodways were that can't be encroached upon, as well as where the YOLO bypass. Those are both referred to in the plan policies, and so this map will identifies where those are. And the bypass is pretty well known to most folks, but what's not so obvious always are the two designated floodways, and you can see the one on the Sumneth coming down into the delta there, just on the edge of the delta actually, and into the delta, whereas it flows across the McCormick-Williamson tract there in the North Delta. And then you can also see the designated floodway that's just at the very southern tip of the delta there, near its confluence with Stanislaus River.
This map, I think you told me, however, did not include any changes recommended by the draft Central Valley flood plan just released by DWR.
That's right. These are the currently designated floodways in the current boundary of the YOLO bypass. It doesn't reflect the recommendation of the flood board to expand the YOLO bypass. The exact nature of that hasn't been identified yet, and nor does it include the proposed new floodway that would be located between Tracy and Lathrop.
Right.
Yeah. And we can talk about that in a second, because I think there is a place for that in the Delta plan now.
Well, since it's specifically mentioned in the Delta Plan, that's one where, and we referenced a multi-agency agreement on a temporary, tentative boundary.
Yeah.
It would be useful on this map to at least have highlighted in the way that the boundary was identified in the language of the Delta Plan.
Okay. We can add that in, because
Yeah, I don't know how you'd color it or anything
Yeah.
like that, because it isn't officially adopted yet,
Yeah.
but it's certainly something we've specifically recommended, and has some modest agreement with the locals. Yeah, the map reinforces it, right, right. I think I would assume that's a little bit harder to do on the Stanislaus, and then, because it's a series, as I understand it, it's a series of pretty modest, but a lot of little fixes that is going on there. It's not a gigantic bypass that
more a
people are
series
talking.
of levee setbacks, perhaps.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. All right. Any questions on that? All right. The next tab
Where's the Delta plan?
that I have is the figures and sidebars. What's
The next piece of it would be the Delta plan map. I
Oh,
think.
okay.
You
All
know,
right. I just had it out of, well,
Maybe I've got it out of order.
I don't know. Who
Yeah, I
knows?
think so.
Anyway, this is the Delta Plan map we've been looking at. It's the fold-out, and it's land use and some boundaries.
Yeah, and so what we're trying to do, people said, well, what's the plan? And so part of what we're doing is compile a map that shows what the plan is. So what this does is it identifies the urban areas, the urbanizing areas that we refer to often in the plan. Talks about the rural land uses. You can see where agriculture, open space, existing nature preserves are. Identifies the key water features of the Delta, of course, the rivers, streams, and lakes, as well as the canals and aqueducts and pumping plants. It identifies the restoration opportunity areas that are currently proposed in the BDCP and the drafts that have been released to the public. And then it has flood management facilities, so it has the project levies, non-project levies. In the non-project levies, we've separated out the urban levies that are proposed for improvement to 200-year status, as well as we've identified the freshwater pathway that would be in the policy that we've proposed a high priority for improvement in the interim, with interim priorities for levee improvements there. We're still pulling together the map for the proposed new South San Joaquin bypass, but that would also be one of these that we would depict in here. So you can really see a graphic depiction of
Right.
the water facilities and the land uses and the other activities that are proposed in the Delta Plan. And we would imagine that over time that this map would evolve to show additional facilities as they come into the Delta Plan when projects are amended in. So if BDCP is approved, we could identify more carefully the restoration opportunity areas and the potential route of any conveyance facilities. When the flood plan is adopted, if they actually identify what the boundary of the new wider YOLO bypass would be, we could identify what that would be. So we could begin to put together a visual depiction of, hey, what is the plan for the Delta? So for those of us who, are graphic learners as opposed to verbal learners, we've got a map of what's going on.
Dan? Oh,
I'm sorry, Pat.
did you intentionally decide not to put a line for where the primary and secondary zone is?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I kind of, in the Delta Reform Act, it's not a relevant boundary, really. It affects the Protection Commission's actions, but we don't have different policies, within the Delta Reform Act between the primary and secondary zone. And my own viewpoint, it somewhat creates an artificial distinction between, in terms of what we're trying to do.
Okay.
Okay, any questions on this? Okay. Put a source on the map, please.
Yes.
Okay. All right, well, the next one is, the figures, the charts and sidebars are not ready to go, and we'll get back to that. And then the last one I had is what Pat had previously pulled out. It's kind of a representative exemplar of an implementation timeline. I understand you're intending to try to do something comparable for each of the chapters that are relevant on that issue.
Yeah, our thinking is that we would have, in Chapter 1, which is the
That
sort of
last
summary
bit
and
done.
introduction, we would have a kind of rolled up big picture. What are the key things that have to happen, and when do we anticipate they would happen? DDCP, flows, storage studies, national heritage area, short-term levy upgrades, the prioritization, and then in each chapter we would have the recommendations and policies laid out, short-term, medium-term. We're not going to probably identify the long-term actions because there are things that are happening 25, 35 years from now. Trying to put them in a schedule probably isn't relevant. And we'd also identify the agencies who would be the state agencies who would have the leads for various actions, so we would know who was responsible.
Just a comment, the effective date in Chapter 4 is kind of deceptive because most of the ecosystem stuff is what we're doing, but except for the first one on flow objectives, which is water board stuff. So there's it says on adoption. I assume other chapters will, like the flood stuff, is going to have endlessly different dates for the Central Valley Flood Board.
That's correct.
Yeah.
We're actually taking that out too, right? Effective date.
I'm sorry, Cindy. What?
Oh, we're actually taking that column out, effective date, because we've sort of had the same
Oh, okay.
realization, so
Yeah.
it's coming
All right.
out.
Other questions? Okay.